At 9:53 a.m. on December 7, 2009, Teresa Powell called West Valley City, Utah Police Dispatch. She had been unable to reach anyone at her son's home following a call she received reporting her grandsons were missing from daycare that morning. It was unusual for the boys to be absent, and neither Terry's son, Josh Powell, or his wife, Susan, had called to report they wouldn't be coming in. After the call, Terry and her daughter drove to Josh and Susan's home and met with police. The house was locked up and there were no signs of activity inside. Worried about the possibility of carbon monoxide poisoning, police broke a window to gain entry. A quick search found no one inside, and it immediately became of interest where the family had gone. Within a few hours, 3 of the Powells would be confirmed alive and well. The 4th member of the family, Susan, remained missing. The events of December 7th would kick off a years-long struggle to find the truth that would end in tragedy. Susan Cox was born on October 16, 1981 in Alamogordo, New Mexico. She was the 3rd of 4 girls born to Chuck and Judy Cox. In 1991, the Cox family moved to Washington State, where Susan would finish high school and go on to graduate from beauty school. Susan's family described her as being a positive and determined person. She was beautiful and charming with a sunny demeanor that lit up every room she walked into. Above all else, Susan was eager to marry and have children. A devoted member of the Mormon faith, Susan attended church functions regularly and was a member of a singles ward when she met Josh Powell in 2000. The pair would date for just 2 months before Josh proposed. On April 6, 2001, less than a year after first meeting, 19-year-old Susan and 23-year-old Josh married. The young couple bounced around homes in Washington until in 2003 they decided to leave for Utah. They lived with family there until they were able to purchase their first home together in West Valley City. In January of 2005, Susan gave birth to their first child, Charlie. Friends and family recall how happy Susan was to not only finally have the baby she dreamed of, but also to have given Josh a son. Charlie would become a big brother in 2007 with the arrival of the couple's second child, Braden. Susan wanted to stay at home with her children as they grew up, and in 2006 she quit working to be a full-time mom. Unfortunately, finances in the Powell home weren't doing well, and she was forced to find employment once again. Susan accepted a job at Wells Fargo in Salt Lake City, a position she still held when she disappeared. There are 3 different accounts of the last day Susan was seen alive. For the purposes of getting down a timeline, we're going to focus on 2 of these. The timeline provided by Susan's friend, Giovanna Owings, and the timeline Josh Powell gave investigators the evening of December 7th. The 3rd timeline will be discussed later. Susan attended church from 10 a.m. to noon the morning of December 6th. After walking home, she called Giovanna and asked her to come over. The call to Giovanna, placed at 2:29 p.m., would be the final time Susan's cell phone was ever used. Giovanna ate lunch with the Powell family around 3:45 or 4 p.m. Approximately half an hour later, Susan became tired and decided to go to bed and take a nap. Josh said that after Susan laid down, he kept Giovanna company while he cleaned the house from 4:30 to 6:30. According to Giovanna, she and Josh both left the Powell home between 5:15 and 5:30 because Josh was taking his 2 sons sledding. Josh's account of the day differs somewhat here. He said that Susan woke up and they all had dinner around 6:30. Shortly after, one of the children fell asleep, leaving him to take only the other child sledding around 7. Josh arrived back at home between 8:30 and 9:30 that night. He said Susan was watching TV while he read a bedtime story to the son he'd taken sledding. It was around 10 p.m. when Susan asked Josh to clean the couch. He did, and then sat down and watched a movie with her until she went to bed at 12:30. Susan was still sleeping when Josh woke up both of his children and got them into the car, leaving around 1:30 or 2 a.m. Josh said he had decided to take the boys on an unplanned camping trip at the Pony Express Trail in Utah's West Desert. By approximately 3:30 that morning, Josh had reached a point on the trail where he was ready to sleep. He and the boys woke back up around dawn, and Josh began driving again, this time without a specific destination. At 2 p.m., he finally decided to return home. On his way back, Josh made his first attempt to contact Susan. When she didn't answer, he left her a voicemail letting her know he would be home soon. It was approximately 5 p.m. when Josh pulled into the Wells Fargo parking lot and called Susan again. He left another voicemail, this time letting her know he was waiting outside to pick her up. He stayed there until 5:30 when Terry called to let him know Susan wasn't at work and the police were at his home, so he needed to get there right away. He left Wells Fargo and took Charlie and Braden to get something to eat before finally coming back home at 6:40 p.m. At 7:15 that night, Josh sat down for an interview with Detective Ellis Maxwell, who would become the lead investigator on Susan's case. The interview lasted only an hour, and Josh agreed to return at 9 a.m. the following day to continue it. The police who broke into the Powell home on December 7th immediately ran into a strange scene inside. 2 box fans were running at full speed in the living room. One fan sat pointed at the couch. The other was tipped to lean on the couch and point toward the floor. It appeared the fans were being used to help dry damp spots on the carpet and couch. Jennifer Graves, Josh's sister, and Terry Powell had entered the house with police and started taking a look around. In Josh and Susan's bedroom, Jennifer located Susan's purse sitting on a bedside table. She thought it was odd that Susan might have left the house without it or the wallet Jennifer found inside. Susan's cell phone was not found anywhere in the home, indicating she may have taken it with her when she left. Notably, it was during this first walkthrough of the Powell home that Jennifer began to worry about Susan's safety. In a letter to police, Jennifer said, "The thought did go through my mind at that time that maybe there was foul play, that Josh had done something to Susan, considering the history of their relationship, but I pushed it from my mind and said nothing." A later, more in-depth investigation of the house revealed some disturbing evidence. On the tile floor beside the couch was a collection of tiny red droplets. The droplets were sampled, and lab testing confirmed that they were blood. A DNA test identified the blood as likely having come from Susan. In spite of the attempt to clean the couch, a stain was found on its front right side. This stain was also sampled and sent for testing, and it returned the same results. A case was beginning to build for Susan not having left her home willingly. In most cases where a married person abruptly disappears, their spouse is the first suspect. Josh Powell wasn't immediately named a person of interest, but investigators would be keeping a close eye on him. Their suspicions seemed to have been unwarranted according to Susan's loved ones, though. In the days after she was reported missing, Susan's father, Chuck Cox, spoke to the media. He told reporters that Susan's vanishing seemed out of the blue to him. Chuck said Susan and Josh had their problems like any couple does, but that it was never anything serious and they always worked through things. It would soon become clear that Chuck's account of the Powell's marriage wasn't entirely accurate. The trouble with Josh Powell and the Cox family began even before he married Susan. In the documentary, The Disappearance of Susan Cox Powell, Susan's sister Denise states that she and her parents tried to convince Susan not to marry Josh. Judy Cox recalls telling her daughter to date around for a while and have fun. When Susan questioned Judy's opinion, Judy told her she saw darkness in Josh. Most of the statements from those who knew Josh and Susan describe them the same way. Susan was a beautiful person, a ray of sunshine, and very different from her husband. Josh was self-absorbed and monopolized conversations. He expected everything to be done the way he wanted and was notoriously inconsiderate to everyone around him. The people who knew Susan loved her, but they couldn't stand Josh. Kiersey Hallowell was one of Susan's best friends. She has spoken out against Josh and his treatment of Susan, saying he was overbearing and obsessive. Tara Allred, another of Susan's friends, has said that Josh had a lot of expectations of Susan, and he would make her feel bad if she didn't meet them all. She disliked the way Josh acted towards Susan so much that she eventually refused to go to the Powell home. She instead would ask Susan to meet her elsewhere to spend time together. Josh's treatment of Susan was one of the main problems in the couple's marriage, but it wasn't the only one. He had also started to take on some rather unhinged views. A 2010 email Kiersey Hallowell sent to Sergeant Robert Bobrowski provides details of an incident that happened in the summer of 2008. Susan had asked Kiersey to come over to the Powell home following an argument she and Josh had. Kiersey arrived to find Susan visibly shaken, asking her to write down everything as she recounted what happened. Josh claimed that Susan was a liar for spending more money at the grocery store than she told him she would. Susan tried to explain that sometimes she would arrive at the store and remember some things she'd forgotten to tell him about, but he was unwilling to understand. He genuinely expected his wife to look through weekly ads and coupons, memorize the prices of items, and only purchase things that were low cost. It was well known among friends and family that Josh was extremely controlling of the Powell family finances, yet he would spend money on whatever he wanted, whenever he wanted. Josh was so stingy that it extended to what and when Susan could feed and clothe their children. He told Susan, "It just works better if I handle all the expenses and the money. That's the way it works." And that soon they would have to skip the country because the economy was so bad. Susan tried to discuss a conversation the couple had where Josh had told her she could spend money on tithing at church. Josh voiced his disagreement with her continuing the payments, saying, "If you pay tithing when you're not supposed to, you are going to hell. And if you pay tithing and don't believe in it, bad things will happen to you and you will go to hell." He then called Susan a religious fanatic, but refused to give any reason he felt that way when asked. Susan pleaded with Josh to get help for his depression and other issues. She wanted to raise their children in a happy home. Josh wasn't interested and claimed she was the one who needed help because she was aggressive and liked to pick fights. The argument was then again interrupted by Josh's paranoid delusions. He said the family needed to move to a place with a lot of water because the earth would eventually run out. Susan tried to keep Josh on track, expressing that she wanted to fix their marriage and show their children what a healthy relationship looks like. Josh responded by telling her she was a horrible person and blaming the Mormon Church turning people into Republicans for increased rates of depression in some states. The entire argument is a display of how out of hand Josh's behavior was later in his marriage. There were other people in Susan and Josh's lives who had been present when Josh said some discomforting things. At a 2008 Christmas party, Josh became engaged in a conversation with two other people about crime shows. The discussion turned to what would be the best way to hide a body. Josh told them that the West Desert, where the Powell family liked to go camping, would be the perfect place. The area is covered in abandoned mine shafts that have become dangerously unstable. He believed no one would be brave enough to search them and the body would never be found. Apparently, this type of talk wasn't out of character for Josh. Susan confided in a friend that Josh had often spoken about how he thought he could get away with murder. She made a point to tell the friend Josh wasn't saying this in a joking manner. He meant it. This friend met Josh sometime after their conversation with Susan and had a discussion with him that led exactly in that direction. Aside from being mean to Susan, Josh was cold and indifferent. In an email to Detective Maxwell shortly after Susan went missing, Chuck Cox described a visit the Powell family made to his home in Washington the previous February. He said that Josh spent a lot of their visit at his dad's home while Susan remained with her parents. When Josh was around, he treated Susan and the rest of the Cox family poorly, being outright rude at times. Chuck said Josh showed a total lack of care or concern for the feelings of anyone around him. At the Powell's home in Utah, Josh spent most of his time downstairs in his office. He appeared to have little interest in spending time with Susan or his own children. Josh could be cruel toward Charlie and Braden as well. Kiersey Hellowell told Sergeant Bobrowski that Susan had confided in her about a time one of the Powell children was caught playing with diaper cream. Josh decided to punish the boy by putting him into his bedroom and holding the door closed. The child was allegedly screaming in what Susan described as an abnormal, terrified way, while Josh continued to hold the door. When Susan told Josh to let their son out, Josh screamed at her to "get the hell out." Susan has also stated that Josh would tell the boys negative things to warp their minds to his way of thinking. In later years, their son Charlie would be documented as telling other people about how evil Mormons are and claiming Susan's parents were abusive toward her. Susan told those close to her that Josh was no longer the man she had married. The reality is much darker, though. Josh was never the person Susan fell in love with. In fact, the real Josh Powell was a total mystery when they married. He'd started to show signs there was something wrong at an early age. Court documents from the 1992 divorce of Josh's parents reveal that Josh displayed disturbing and sometimes violent tendencies. Terry alleged that Josh and an unnamed brother had pushed and hit her when they were around the age of 15. She also claimed that when Josh was a teenager, she once asked him to do the dishes, and he responded with, "Don't push it, Mom." Josh held a butcher knife in one hand as he spoke with a threatening tone, scaring Terry so much she just left the room and went to another part of the house. Terry felt that Josh's father, Stephen, had built him to be the man he became. Terry claims that the Stephen Powell she married was a loving husband and devout Mormon. The pair had 5 children together who they started out raising to have strong Mormon values. Over time, Stephen developed a hatred and distrust of the church. He started taking a strong interest in explicit photos and videos, became controlling of his wife and children, and began to obsess over another woman. The woman was a married member of he and Terry's church congregation, but that didn't stop Stephen from telling Terry he wanted her as a second wife. He admitted that if anything happened to the woman's husband, he would like to raise her children with her. Stephen's actions in regards to the church woman would later be mirrored as he became obsessed with a new woman years later. Stephen was open with his children about his thoughts and interests. Jennifer Graves remembers being at a hotel on a business trip with her father when he turned the TV to an explicit channel. Stephen's children were under the age of 10 when he began providing them with explicit materials. He got his daughters on birth control between ages 9 and 12. Jennifer felt that her father's actions had an especially strong effect on Josh. Terry once recalled an incident where Josh, referring to a girl his brother liked, said, "All she's good for is her body." This misogyny even extended to family, as Josh allegedly told Terry that respect is earned and then asked her what she'd ever done to earn his. Despite how comfortable he seemed with his children being exposed to adult themes early in life, Stephen was not a lax parent. Terry reported that Stephen would become angry and blow up on the children in a very violent manner. He was directing this anger solely at Josh on an almost daily basis for years. He claimed not to know how to handle Josh as he got older because he could no longer spank him, a punishment he said wasn't effective anyways. Josh tried to end his life around the age of 13, possibly as a result of the constant attacks his father launched on him. Terry thought that everything Stephen did led Josh to have an inability to understand where boundaries were and what constituted acceptable behavior. Terry's sister, Becky Mulcahy, has corroborated Terry's claims. She felt that all of the older Powell boys believed they had an unquestionable right to do as they pleased. She said they held a deep hatred of women and authority, all encouraged by their father. Stephen's outspoken and unabashed nature never changed, and after Josh married Susan, his inappropriate behavior continued. For 6 months in 2002, Susan and Josh lived in Stephen Powell's home. Over the course of those months, Susan became Stephen's obsession. Stephen owned a video camera, and he spent a lot of time recording himself and Susan, sometimes without her consent. When Susan was aware she was on camera, she frequently appeared very uncomfortable. It's no mystery as to why. In one video, Susan begins to walk away from Stephen, and as she does, he focuses the camera on her butt. Despite being turned away from him, she seems to be fully aware he's doing this, as she covers her backside with a box and says, "No." In response, Stephen can be heard saying, "Move your hand, move the box," while continuing to record her. Capturing Susan on video wasn't Stephen's only way of attempting to satiate his desire for her. He recorded himself talking about his adoration for Susan and reportedly created photos of them engaged in sexual acts. Using a pseudonym, Steve Chantry, Stephen posted music he made online where he sang songs inspired by Susan. He even stole Susan's undergarments and retrieved things she threw away from the trash. This included cotton balls, hair, and most disturbingly, used feminine products, all of which he placed into plastic bags with Susan's name and the date on them. Stephen confronted Susan about his feelings for her and the fact he felt she acted in such a way that she must feel the same. The interaction was audio recorded, and in that recording, Susan sounds uncomfortable and clearly is uninterested in any kind of romantic relationship with her father-in-law. Susan eventually reached a point where she could no longer continue living with Stephen. She and Josh moved out of his home and left Washington. It's thought that Josh may have struggled with the way Stephen acted toward Susan, but his father could manipulate him into believing nothing was going on. Investigators interviewing Susan's Wells Fargo coworkers were informed she had a secret lockbox there that she had put important documents into. The box was retrieved, and detectives found that it held 2 things of interest. The first was a videotape Susan had made showing and talking about all of her and Josh's assets. Authorities discovered that Susan had visited a divorce lawyer who told her to make the tape in case she chose to go forward with separating from Josh. In the video, Susan walks through her home showing various expensive items, including thousands of dollars of books containing graphic design templates, tools, and an RC car with multiple modifications. Nearly everything Susan shows is something purchased by Josh. Susan remarks that Josh had bought these expensive things, had to bankrupt them, and then purchased more with her credit. At the end of the video, Susan comments that she is making sure that if something happens to me or my family or all of us, that our assets are documented. The video was recorded July 29, 2008, about a year and a half before she vanished. The second thing in the lockbox was Susan's handwritten will. It included a note that said, "For family, friends of Susan, all except for Josh Powell, husband. I don't trust him." The note made it clear that she was keeping things at work to hide them from her husband. The will alleged that Josh told Susan, "If we divorce, there will be no lawyers, only a mediator, and I will ruin you. I would be ruined too, but you would be destroyed, and your life would be over, and the boys will not grow up with a mom and dad." Susan was just 27 years old when the will was written, an age normally considered not nearly old enough to make end-of-life preparations. In a single, chilling sentence within the final words of the will, Susan tells the reader why she chose to write it. "If I die, it may not be an accident, even if it looks like one." Testimony from Susan's friends and family and the information in her will indicate that Susan was really struggling to keep her marriage together. Divorce had finally become an option. Judy Cox has said that the couple weren't communicating well anymore by the time Susan disappeared. By all accounts, any time a discussion was needed between them, it became a fight. Josh's seemingly unpredictable rage wouldn't have helped the situation. He'd become angry at Susan for things that shouldn't have been a problem. Things like giving each of their sons a whole hot dog instead of splitting one in half. It's likely Susan could never be sure what would set Josh off, making it nearly impossible to talk over their problems. The will was an important piece of evidence that Josh and Susan's marriage was in a dire state, and that Susan had reason to fear for her life. It proved that investigators had good reason to keep suspecting that Josh Powell had done something to make his wife disappear, and the case would only continue to build against him. Returning to Giovanna and Josh's accounts of the last day Susan was seen, there are a few notable details. Something that has always stuck out in Josh's story is the spur-of-the-moment camping trip he took Charlie and Braden on. The timing is bizarre, but even stranger are the weather conditions at the time. A snowstorm had blown in, and temperatures were in the teens that night. Josh did say the three of them slept in the family's van, but the story still makes little sense. Both Josh and Giovanna agreed that Josh cooked lunch on the 6th. He even brought the pancakes into the living room to serve his wife and Giovanna where they sat. Jennifer Graves says that Josh never cooked. He refused to. Susan was home while Josh was cooking, making it strange that he would suddenly choose to do it himself. Giovanna also recalled Josh placing a blanket over Susan to keep her warm. Josh wasn't known to be a caring, concerned husband toward Susan. There are various accounts of the way he treated Susan as if she should be taking care of him just as much as she took care of their children. It was very out of character for him to serve her food, clean up the kitchen, and make an effort to keep her comfortable. So out of character that many people, including Detective Ellis Maxwell, found it suspicious. Giovanna remembers Susan suddenly becoming very tired shortly after she ate lunch. She laid down for a nap in bed, and that was the last time anyone outside the Powell family saw her alive. Both investigators and some of those close to Susan and Josh suspect that Josh may have put something into Susan's food to sedate her. During their investigation of the Powell home, police found two medications, phenazopyridine and cyclobenzaprine. The first medication is commonly known under the brand name Azo. It's an over-the-counter medication used to treat urinary tract infections, and it can usually be taken without experiencing serious side effects. The other medication, cyclobenzaprine, was a muscle relaxant. This is a prescription-only medication, and it's known to act as a sedative. If a large dose is taken, the drowsiness normally experienced when taking the medication could intensify and even lead to a loss of consciousness, impaired motor skills, and confusion, among other symptoms. It would be extremely hard to run or fight for your life if you were given a heavy dose of a muscle relaxant. There were leftover pancakes found in the Powell's fridge, and they were sent for testing. No substances of interest were found, but that hardly proves that Josh didn't put anything into the pancakes he gave Susan. In the opinion of Detective Maxwell, Susan wasn't drugged enough to end her life. He believes she actually may have been strangled. Maxwell cites the blood droplets found next to the couch as potential evidence of this. He has suggested that the assault could have led Susan to start coughing up blood that then splattered across the tile. The muscle relaxant was likely just used to pacify her. Detective Maxwell has pointed out something Josh did that he felt might be indicative of his guilt. In their first interview, Maxwell asked to look at Josh's hands. At the second interview, he asked again, but this time took a photo of them. Josh became extremely uncomfortable and started to claim the police were trying to trap him. He seemed highly paranoid, but that isn't all too surprising considering how paranoid he appeared before his wife vanished. When Detective Maxwell left Josh sitting alone in the interview room for a short time, he was caught on camera seemingly hyper-focused on his hands. He rubs them together, looks at them, and just generally appears deep in thought for an extended time. Detective Maxwell has questioned if Josh was remembering doing something with those hands as he stared up. Josh didn't need to worry about his hands, though. He'd done plenty of other highly suspicious things that caught the attention of investigators. Susan's phone was found in the family's van, the vehicle Josh had been driving the entire time he and the Powell boys were gone. Josh was asked why he kept calling his wife if he knew she didn't have her cell phone. He claimed that he had forgotten it was in the van with him. Investigators looking over the phone later realized its SIM card had been removed. On December 8th, Josh returned to the West Valley City Police Department as he promised the night before, but he didn't make it there by 9 a.m. He never showed up until noon. So what was Josh doing with his time prior to that? According to his sister, she and Terry Powell went to Josh's house that morning and found him doing laundry and cleaning out the van. Detective Maxwell has expressed some concerns about why Josh was doing so much cleaning and what else he might have done during that time. When Josh finally arrived at the police station, he was asked to go through the events of the 6th and 7th again. The account Josh would give during this interview is the third timeline I mentioned earlier in the video. The majority of what he says happened on the 6th is close to both his first story and what Giovanna Owings told detectives. It's not until the 7th that the details become more skewed. Josh maintained his previous story with only minor differences up until where he and his sons reached the Pony Express Trail. There, he tells Detective Maxwell that he actually drove a distance of approximately 20 miles on the trail before he finally stopped to sleep. He then gives more specific information about what happened when he and the boys woke up around dawn, claiming they made s'mores before driving to Simpson Springs. They left that area sometime between 11 a.m. and noon and stopped in Lehigh for lunch. Josh's first call to Susan happened when he was leaving Lehigh. At 3 p.m., Giovanna finally reached Josh and let him know what was going on at home, including that Susan never arrived at work that day. Josh claimed he hadn't gone to work or sent the kids to daycare because he was confused and thought it was Sunday. When asked where Susan was, Josh said, "At work," despite just being told that wasn't the case and making the claim about it being Sunday. He then went to Wells Fargo and sat in the parking lot waiting for Susan to get off work until his sister called around 5:30 p.m. and again informed him Susan wasn't there. At the end of the second interview, Josh was told a warrant was being served on his van. It would have taken about an hour for Josh to have the van returned to him, but he waited just 15 minutes before deciding to leave without it. He took a taxi to the airport in Salt Lake City and rented a car. That car would lead to a mystery still not solved to this day. Between the time Josh rented the car on the 8th and when he returned it the evening of the 10th, he drove 807 miles. It was learned that from 10:26 p.m. on the 8th to 4:39 p.m. on the 9th, his children were with his mother. Investigators have never been able to uncover what Josh did or where he went during that time. He claimed that he'd simply taken the car on a very long drive as police were still searching his home. Jennifer Graves has stated she did not believe him. She and Detective Maxwell have both questioned if Josh spent those hours moving Susan's remains. Prior to being dropped off with Terry, Charlie Powell was interviewed by an investigator from the South Valley Children's Justice Center. It was 3 p.m. at the time of the interview, according to the video recording. Charlie told the investigator he was hungry and that he hadn't eaten that day. Irrelevant to the questioning, sure, but an example of his father's neglect. Charlie was just 4 years old when his mother disappeared, but the video makes it clear how intelligent he was. The answers he provided to the questions presented seem like fantasy when first heard, It's when they are examined more closely with consideration to the case at hand that they become startling. Charlie was asked what he did the night prior to the interview. He responded that he and his family, Susan included, went camping at Dinosaur National Park. The interviewer asked him how they got to the park and what they did after they were done camping. He told her they got there and back home by airplane, and when they left they went to a beach before going home. When asked where his mom and dad were during the interview, smart little Charlie said his mom went to work and his dad was talking to the police because a window was broken. He was certainly referring to the window officers broke to gain entry to the Powell home on December 7th. But how did he think the window got that way? He said his grandma and grandpa threw a rock into it. This is interesting, as it was later revealed that Josh told his sons that Susan's parents were evil Mormons who abused their mother. Could he have told Charlie they threw a rock into the window too? The interviewer then moved on to asking who came home with Charlie when they got back from camping. He said his dad did, but his mom stayed at Dinosaur National Park where the crystals that grow in rocks are. The crystals were so pretty that she wanted to stay there to look at them. Perhaps the most common theory of where Susan Powell's remains lie is in one of the many abandoned mine shafts littered across Utah's West Desert. It's so pervasive that in 2022, a group on the YouTube channel Heavy D Sparks were searching for Susan in those mines when they found bones and clothing. It was later concluded that they'd found men's clothing, and the DNA in the bones wasn't human. There is still something interesting about that video, though. At the end, Dave Sparks sits looking around the mine when he comments, "I don't know if the camera is doing this justice, but guys, this place is just glistening with different types of crystals and geodes and all sorts of different interesting rocks and minerals." The camera does pick it up somewhat, and the mine is clearly full of many pretty crystals. Josh hired a lawyer early in the investigation into his wife's disappearance. He had agreed to more interviews and a polygraph, but later decided against both on his lawyer's advice. Investigators were able to convince him to return for a blood draw to obtain DNA and to answer a few questions with his lawyer present. During that final interview, Josh only answered questions about Susan that would help police identify her body if it were found. By December 19th, Josh had been named the sole person of interest in Susan's case. Police obtained warrants for further searches of the Powell home and both Josh and Susan's electronic devices. Searches began of the various abandoned mines located in the West Desert, proving Josh was wrong when he thought nobody would be willing to look there. While investigators worked day in and day out to find Susan, Josh told his children's daycare he wouldn't need their services any longer, attempted to withdraw Susan's retirement money at Wells Fargo, and then decided to leave Utah. During the week of January 9th, 2010, Josh packed all of the family's belongings and took his children with him back to Stephen Powell's home in Washington. He allegedly never inquired about the status of the investigation. The Powell family claimed their theory was that Susan had run off with another man to start a new life. The story didn't make sense to anyone in Susan's family or friend group. Josh had a diary of Susan's from her early teens that they claim proved she was sexually promiscuous and emotionally unstable. They took advantage of a passage where Susan had written about an attempt to take her own life, which she later clarified was not actually her intent. Chuck Cox confirmed he remembered the incident and provided more details. It happened when Susan was around 13 and involved a very small amount of over-the-counter medication. She was taken to the ER as a safety measure and then saw social workers who determined she was not at risk. Ridiculously, Stephen Powell said that Susan led a double life from the time she was 13, 14, or possibly even 12 in regards to the entries. Stephen seemed to have a lot to say about Susan, unsurprisingly. The case had gained national attention, and when he was invited on Good Morning America, Stephen was all too happy to give a televised interview. He claimed that he and Susan were in love and implied they had a physical relationship, stating, "Susan was very sexual with me. We interacted in a lot of sexual ways because Susan enjoys doing that." A mortified Chuck Cox would respond to this by saying it was absolutely false and that Stephen's advances towards Susan were unwanted. Growing suspicions of Stephen led authorities in Washington to execute several warrants on his home and electronics. What they found would go from shocking to turning the case on its head entirely. Stephen liked to document his daily life not just in video form, but in writing as well. In a journal entry from just 14 hours after Susan disappeared, he said he felt sick because he believed she was deceased. He called Josh's camping story so implausible and said his conversation with Josh was so unconvincing that I fear the worst. Stephen admitted that two of Josh's siblings, Michael and Alina, didn't believe him either. They allegedly told him to tighten up his story because it sounded weak and unconvincing. Michael was said to have told Stephen that he felt Josh's alibi was so bad that it had to have been the result of a crime of passion, not something he planned to do. Stephen seemed to have his own thoughts on Josh having planned the crime, though. He recalled Josh purchasing a welder and a carpet cleaner within 2 weeks of Susan's disappearance. He also felt that Josh spent the 20 hours he was gone taking Susan's remains somewhere far away. Stephen took a step back in one passage and wrote that he had decided years before this that of all his children, Josh was the one capable of doing such a thing. He blamed his ex-wife for Josh's potential actions, stating he believed Josh's motive for harming Susan was to avoid the kind of painful divorce he watched his parents go through. Stephen wanted Josh and his children to stay together, but said he was upset that Josh could hurt such a beautiful woman, and he believed if Josh could do something like this once, he could do it again, writing, quote, "If things go badly, he could murder the boys and himself." The searches of Stephen's home also uncovered his collection of homemade videotapes. A disgusting truth was contained within some of them. Stephen had been secretly recording Susan, other women, and underage girls from his neighborhood while in the bathroom. In September of 2011, Stephen was arrested and charged with 14 counts of voyeurism and 1 count relating to recording the neighborhood girls, if you catch my drift. Josh and his sons were still living with Stephen when he was arrested. Due to both the charges against Stephen and authorities suspecting Josh and Susan's disappearance, the boys were placed into foster care. At a September 28th hearing, Assistant Attorney General John Long said that Josh's lack of cooperation had led investigators to believe he'd harmed Susan. Temporary custody would then be awarded to Susan's parents, with Josh being allowed visitation. This was the start of the chain of events that led to an incident so horrific that it would forever alter the lives of the people who loved Susan Powell. To regain custody of his children, Josh had to comply with court-ordered requirements and cooperate with social workers. He was told to leave his father's home and that he would have to pass multiple evaluations. Josh rented a home in a cul-de-sac in Graham, Washington, and worked well with both supervising entities and social workers. The reviews of his visits with the boys were good. Josh apparently always seemed happy to see Charlie and Braden, and he used every minute of the time allotted to him. Supervisors said that he would plan activities to do with the kids, and he showed them a lot of love and care. There were some who worried about the Powell boys visiting Josh, though. In an email sent September 29th to the company contracted to supervise the visits, social worker Forrest Jacobson wrote that 911 is first call if there is any type of emergency, including fleeing with the kids. Reverend Timothy Atkins had supervised a few of Josh's visits when he quit, telling social workers the reason related to Susan. He felt it was obvious police had been building a solid case against Josh, and the boys had been severely affected by the trauma the disappearance had caused. This was especially true for Charlie, who was allegedly very serious and flat, and was known to spout anti-Mormon rhetoric at school. Chuck and Judy Cox echoed the Reverend's statements. They once described the boys as like little robots and said they refused to speak about their mother if asked about her. In late October of 2011, Josh underwent his first psychological evaluation with Dr. James Manley. Manley found Josh to be a competent parent who had a good relationship with his children. He said that Josh was clearly under a lot of stress and struggled not to speak badly of the Mormon Church in front of his sons, but overall, he did not view him as a risk. It seemed that social workers would be recommending that Charlie and Braden be returned to Josh's custody at a February 1, 2012 hearing. Then, just as the court date approached, another shocking discovery was revealed. Investigators who had examined Josh's computer had found over 400 explicit images. These images depicted animated figures, sometimes including well-known cartoon characters from popular shows like SpongeBob SquarePants and The Simpsons. They were engaged in acts including group intimacy, bondage, and acts between family members, including parents and children. Superior Court Judge Catherine Nelson ruled Josh must undergo a psychosexual evaluation. Nelson stated that he needed to clarify his sexuality and parenting history, and that the images did not reflect a healthy parenting perception. Josh's visitation rights were not terminated, and on February 5th, Supervisor Elizabeth Griffin Hall arrived at Josh's house in Graham with Charlie and Braden. The boys exited Griffin Hall's vehicle and ran directly into the open door to the home. As Griffin Hall approached, Josh shut the door before she could reach it and locked her out. Highly concerned for the welfare of the children, Griffin Hall called 911. What followed was a call so frustrating that I almost recommend not listening to it. After explaining the situation to the dispatcher, Griffin Hall had to answer questions about things like her name and what color her vehicle was. She was still trying to convince him the situation needed immediate attention when he told her, quote, "Ma'am, we have to respond to emergency life-threatening situations first." Griffin Hall could smell gasoline as she stood outside the home speaking with 911, something she informed the dispatcher of. She was still begging for police intervention when Josh Powell's house suddenly exploded into a ball of flame. An investigation into the fire found that Josh had placed 10 gallons of gasoline around the house prior to the boys' arrival. After they ran inside, he attacked them with a hatchet before lighting the gas, killing all 3 of them. Josh had sent out emails to some of the people close to him apologizing and providing instructions on how to access his finances and shut off his utilities. In a voicemail left for his sister, Alina, Josh said he just couldn't live without his sons, a motive I can't help but see as a lie when taking all of the evidence into consideration. Investigators would also uncover that Josh was not actually living in the house in Graham. He had remained in Stephen Powell's home, only dressing the Graham house up enough to make it look like it was his residence. This was likely done to fool social workers. Disturbingly, Elizabeth Griffin Hall said Charlie and Braden were especially excited to see their father that day. Josh had told them he had a surprise for them. The Coxes had informed their lawyer, Steve Downing, that Charlie and Braden were beginning to open up to them more. They would talk about what they remembered from the night Susan went missing. In a statement to the media, Downing said, "The oldest boy talked about that they went camping and that Mommy was in the trunk. Mom and Dad got out of the car and Mom disappeared." The statement Charlie made to his grandparents is just one of multiple that indicate he knew his father had done something to his mother. Information previously kept quiet by investigators started to be revealed after Josh's death. It surfaced that the case against Josh was finally coming to a point where authorities were ready to charge him in Susan's disappearance. It had taken years for them to build up enough evidence to proceed without having Susan's remains. A case file released by investigators brought forth information about a woman who claimed she had an affair with Josh just before Susan disappeared. The woman, also a resident of West Valley City, spoke with investigators in August of 2010 and alleged that she had been intimate with Josh for 6 or 7 months in 2009. She knew Josh by the name John Staley and was unaware he had a wife until she saw news coverage of Susan's disappearance. The woman claims that Josh spent approximately $800 on her services in the months they were seeing each other. Detective Maxwell stated that the unnamed woman did call police shortly after Susan vanished, but she wasn't willing to provide anything to corroborate her claims at that time. Charlie and Braden were buried together in a single casket. The Coxes added Susan's name to their headstone, including when she was born and when she went missing. A photo of Susan and her son smiling together sits above their names and dates of birth and death. In a distasteful move, Josh's mother planned to bury him near Charlie and Braden. Chuck and Judy Cox threatened legal action if Terry went through with her decision, delaying the sale of the plot. The idea bothered community members so much that a fundraiser was held to raise the money needed to buy the 2 plots on either side of Charlie and Braden's grave. Pierce County Sheriff Paul Pastor and Detective Ed Troyer, leader of Crime Stoppers of Tacoma-Pierce County, headed the fundraiser, which ended successfully. They stated that if Susan's remains were ever found, they would allow the Cox family use of the plots as they saw fit. On February 17th, Terry issued a statement saying she would not be burying Josh near the boys. Her son-in-law, Kirk Graves, explained that it wasn't hard to convince her it wasn't a good idea and that she had just started off planning Josh's burial poorly. The members of the Powell family who had supported Josh since Susan vanished never wavered in their claims that he was innocent. Josh and his brother, Michael, were very close, and investigators had long suspected Michael was involved in Susan's disappearance. Stephen Powell had alleged in that journal entry that Michael admitted to thinking Josh had hurt Susan, and investigators had other evidence he may have been connected to the case. Josh and Michael were communicating using computer encryption that police were never able to decipher. It seemed like an unnecessary step to take in a conversation between siblings unless something was being hidden. The car Michael had when Susan went missing had been left at a junkyard in Oregon just weeks after she disappeared. Unfortunately, this information only came to light 2 years after he disposed of the vehicle. Still, it piqued investigators' interest, and Michael was interviewed multiple times. Police say that when asked about why he decided to junk the car and what he'd used it for in the time between December 7, 2009 and when he dropped it off, Michael was extremely evasive with his answers. On February 11, 2013, Michael chose to end his life. Some have viewed his death as an admission of guilt. Stephen Powell was convicted of the charges against him and spent time in prison. He died of natural causes July 23, 2018, just over a year after his release. The investigation into Susan's disappearance officially ended in 2013. The memories of her and her children remain alive through the love of their family and the many people whose lives have been touched by their story. A Facebook page providing updates and information about her disappearance remains active. Photos of Susan posing with her children during happy times adorn the top of the page. The Susan Cox Powell Foundation was created in 2010 to help the loved ones of those who are missing and those who are or who love someone who has been a victim of domestic violence. The foundation is headed by Chuck and Judy Cox, with support from Kiersey Hellowell and others who knew Susan or were moved by the events surrounding her disappearance. Since its creation, the foundation has partnered with others to spread their reach. The Tears Foundation oversees the Charlie and Braden Project, providing help with burial costs to parents in Washington who have lost a child between the ages of 1 and 12. The Pierce County Sheriff's Department has developed Charlie's Dinosaur to give children placed into emergency foster care with few things of their own a backpack filled with clothing, hygiene supplies, small toys, and comfort items. Per the Susan Cox Powell Foundation website, the goal is to ensure that Susan, Charlie, and Braden's tragedy is not forgotten, and that others faced with similar ongoing situations get all the help they can, thus leaving a legacy of hope and love. If you are in a situation where you can afford to donate to any of these foundations in memory of Susan and her beloved sons, there are links in the description below. There may be no more we can do to help in protecting them from harm, but we can help others in similar situations find a light in the darkness. Thank you for watching. I hope to see you next time.